Good afternoon. This is George Yates, and we're here with Justice for All. And I'm your host, and we'll be here for the next couple of hours. And we're real excited today to have our guest be a fellow named Nick Yarris. And his book is just coming out here on September the 1st, 7 Days to Live. Nick this book it's an absolutely fascinating account of a young man that was framed for a murder that he didn't commit and spent 21 years on death row. And we're going to get into the entire details of it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time summarizing it for you, but I'll go ahead and bring him in. He's with us today. How you doing there, Nick Yarris?
Good morning, George, and I'm so glad that I get this opportunity to speak, and it's wonderful to kind of feel mentally back in the Virginia area where I've always enjoyed it.
You know, the name of the book is 7 Days to Live, and I did notice while we're talking about the book itself, maybe that's not the most important thing, but the book's just coming out now and hitting the bookstores. But I noticed that the book that I read, the advanced copy that I received, had a 2008 date on it. You were released from prison in 2004. And your book is now coming out in 2014. What delayed its publication?
It was originally set for release in the United Kingdom in 2008 in July, and some advanced copies went out, but the publisher, HarperCollins, stopped publication of the book because I unfortunately was going through a domestic divorce, and they felt like it was taking away from the reader the happy, good feeling that they wished. So it had nothing to do with the book story as you read it, but it's just one of the decisions that a publisher can make. So I settled a lawsuit with HarperCollins, and they paid me this year, and so I'm now free to re-release the book in the United States. Because I was living in the United Kingdom for the last 9 years, I didn't have this opportunity until now.
Well, it's a fascinating story, and, you know, these days it's not unusual at all with the Innocence Project and those guys. And they're going to be on my show later on. I've actually just got some interviews lined up with some of the principals there. Of course, that's the Barry Scheck, Peter Newfield group, you know, the famous lawyers from the O.J. Simpson trial.
Yes, I'm very grateful that a percentage of my book sales will go to the Innocence Project, and that Barry and Peter both are supporting both my book and the new documentary that'll be out next year. So I've been getting a great deal of help from their organization, so I'm going to make a real effort for them as well.
And you've been speaking out against the death penalty ever since your release from prison because you were framed for a murder that you did not commit. You were exonerated. You were declared innocent of the charges after spending 21 years on death row. And if there was ever a better argument for not having the death penalty, it would be your case. Isn't that a fact?
It's one of those sad tragedies where I'm the 140th person set free from death row from getting it wrong.
140 people.
Yeah, I was the 13th man proven innocent by DNA. So it goes to show that it's not just me. It was many people. Unfortunately, mine was a harrowing tale that took place in 1968, actually, when I was raped and attacked as a young boy, and I was left with a brain disorder called aphasia. And it affected my whole childhood and development, and I lost track of my life because I was addicted to drugs and alcohol because of this affliction.
You know, I just want to say this book, 7 Days to Live, is a great read, and anybody that's out there that's listening to us today, either live or later on a feed, because we are on archives.org, and you can get our show on YouTube as well. Justice for All with George Yates on YouTube. You got to read this book, Nick Yarris. It's available at Barnes and Noble and on Amazon and all of that.
No, it's on Amazon and through my personal website, nickjyaris.net. You can get the Kindle version, of course, online. But we're just starting out again. I'm hoping to get distribution somewhere along the line, and hopefully it will be nationally recognized. Like I said, I worked very hard for the education I gave myself to write a book that wasn't a self-glorification, it was a story that really enhanced it.
How did you survive? How did you survive 21 years on death row? How did you do it?
I guess one of my favorite lines is, I guess I've had all of the hard bark peeled off of me. I think what you go through in the experiences of someone who was not only accused of a rape and a murder, but was accused of being a psychological predator, so that inside a prison I was treated with all the deference of the world. And I mean, professional deference can be chilling in the way that people treated me. So I learned very early on that I had to go through a process, and that process of humility took a lot of pain and tears and suffering, but I think that there's a lot of truth that what comes from suffering is only beauty.
Well, how does somebody get convicted of a crime they didn't commit? Why don't you just tell our listeners how this happened?
Well, at the age of 20, I was stopped for a motor vehicle violation in the city of Chester by patrolman Benjamin Wright. And Benjamin Wright was a big man, and he walked up to my car, and unfortunately, inside of the car, the music was blasting, and my mind was frantic. I was high on drugs, and I have a brain disorder that makes me shut down, and I had difficulty at times to process language. So when he walked up to the car and he beat on the window, I didn't respond. I kept looking forward, just terrified. He opened the door. He ripped me from the car. He put his arm against my forearm and pushed me back over the roof of the car with my neck backwards, and I started flailing. So I knocked his arm away, and I stood back, and then he reached down and took his club out. As he did, I grabbed his wrist. When I grabbed his wrist, I took the stick out of his hand like it was a small child. The adrenaline flowing from my body was nothing. He just stood there for a second. Then, in a rage, he just reached down and began grabbing for his weapon. When he grabbed his service revolver, I grabbed his wrist, and the gun went off into the ground. I began yelling, "Okay," as if that was my surrender word. Like, I just kept shouting it over and over. When he put the gun to my head, put me in the backseat of the car, slammed the back door, got in the front seat and composed himself for a minute, picked up the radio, and then pretended that the assault was still going on, that he was under duress.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was then taken into custody and charged by Officer Wright's words with attempted murder, kidnapping, assault with a deadly weapon, and possession of a firearm. I was thrown into the Delaware County prison and put into solitary confinement under a maximum bail of $100,000 cash, and I was told that I faced life imprisonment for the charges by Officer Wright. And I collapsed. I went mental. I broke down like I was destroyed. It was 4 days before Christmas in 1981. I was 20 years old, and I had the world dropped on me.
Well, now, you were ultimately acquitted of those charges.
Yeah, that's the shocker, that even though a jury would find me not guilty of all those charges only 3 months later, the fact remains that while I went through the initial incarceration, I went through mental breakdown where I actually came up with a stupid concocted story where I went forward to the police and told them I knew about a murder of a woman in Delaware who was driven into Pennsylvania. And the police soon figured out that I lied to them, and then they turned around and deliberately framed me for the murder, knowing that I was the perfect patsy for it.
Well, now you were on trial for this incident with the police officer, and you know it's kind of interesting, Nick. I was reading the account of this killing of this young black boy in Missouri, the Brown killing that just occurred. Michael Brown, and apparently that's the sort of thing that now they're saying, oh well, Michael Brown, the officer is now saying that he was going for his gun. Michael Brown was going for the officer's gun, and then the officer shoots Brown. And I was reading that account, and I thought, wow, isn't that exactly how that officer framed Nick Yarris?
Well, we do know that today's technology is going to tell the truth about that forensically. So whatever story is concocted is going to have to match up with the ballistics and everything else. So good luck with that one.
Yeah, but
and that's what undid as you know, that's what undid Officer Benjamin Wright, because he claimed that I fired the pistol inches from his face as he wrestled the gun from me in the last-minute heroic step, because his version differed very from mine. And he claimed that I punched him in his face initially, broke his eyeglasses, hit him with his service revolver 3 times across the face, 5 times in the face, but he didn't have a single scratch or mark on him. And the jury was dumbfounded by someone saying that I viciously knocked him unconscious with a metal pistol, but he didn't have a scratch.
Well, your lawyer did a heck of a job in that case cross-examining that police officer, didn't he?
Yeah, I was but I was befuddled by him not asking many questions, and in fact, he let the officer go on and on and on with an exaggeration that the jury only took 20 minutes to deliberate over.
You're right.
It was my word against that officer, and they only took 20 minutes to find me not guilty.
Well, it's very difficult to win a case when it's the credibility of a police officer versus the credibility of a citizen in front of a judge. You'll never win that. But when it's in front of a jury, jurors have sometimes positive experiences with police, and of course, some jurors have negative experiences with police. So it's possible to win jury trials where it's credibility issues like that. But what was it about?
In a way, my winning the trial verdict at that time was my undoing in a lot of ways, because the prosecutor from Delaware County, Barry Gross, had lost his first major trial, and he went berserk in the courtroom. And it's even proven that he did it during the Nicky Scarfo trial in the federal courts, where he went off and made all kind of nasty outbursts when he lost a trial for murder to the mob. So it was a repeated behavior that I couldn't do anything about because he was in power. And he, on his own, sought the death penalty the very next week without any of the facts of the case changing in that time period, only my acquittal.
So let me, just so for our listeners to get this straight, while you're pending trial for this alleged shooting of a police officer that you were ultimately acquitted of, you were you were upset that you were being charged with a crime that you didn't commit. And so you were trying any possible way to get out of jail. So you made up a story that you knew about. You were going to try to help them solve a murder, and you believed you believed that you had read about this apparently in the newspaper. You saw it was a brutal rape and murder of a young woman, and so you hit upon an idea that a former friend of yours, a drug addict friend, who you believed had died. You thought, you know what? I'm going to say that this fellow who died actually committed this horrible rape and murder, and I know he did it. And that way, if I can help them solve this murder, they're going to let me out. And so
the madness was it's such a crazy
what
idea.
happened? How did that backfire on you, Nick? They
took me out of solitary confinement initially, and they took me into the warden's office and praised me for my civil service and helping them with this remarkable unsolved crime. And they told me that the officer Wright had been spoken to. He had agreed to reduce the charges. I was going to be released on my own signature bail once they had the man in custody. That they took me out of solitary confinement and put me in general population, told me that within 3 days I would be released. So I believed my own madness. So I walked around the prison thinking, oh, God, I'm going to get out, then I can run, I can get away from this, I can somehow dodge all this, it will get behind me. And this is the mindset of someone 20 years old. So 3 days later they came back and they said, you know what? We know that James Brisbois, the man that you accused, is not the killer because he has an alibi. Furthermore, we know that you did the crime. And I was dumbfounded by their connection to just believing that because I had lied that I must be the killer. And then they just told me, in their minds, the reason I killed the woman named Linda Mae Craig on December 15th, 1981, is because she bore a likeness to my girlfriend. And even though it sounds insane now, that's what they went with. And that's how they made it work. So they put a prisoner in the cell next to me who had burglarized the prosecutor's home of Delaware County. And he said that after one night in the cell next to me, that he had gotten a confession from me killing my alibi. Because that was the frustration for the police. How could I be in a bank paying a bank record? How could I be home with family and be in a store witnessed by a clerk all around the time of the murder, but no different in my blood-covered clothing or anything like that ever being accused of me? No physical evidence, nothing. I didn't own a car. I lived 26 miles from the crime scene, but it didn't matter. They needed someone to be charged with the murder.
So they cooked up a jailhouse confession against you. How did the forensic evidence line up against you?
This is the weird thing. We only had serology back then. And
Right.
my downfall was the murderer was a B-positive secretor of his antigens. And I am a B-positive secretor of my antigens, as well as 15% of the white male population. So the thing is, they didn't have a science to define the outcome of the spermatozoa found during the rape and left at the crime scene. They didn't have any way to identify the killer based on fingerprints because the killer wore gloves and left them in the car as a taunt to the police with the doors closed and the lights left on inside the car so they could see him when they got there.
And those gloves were not introduced at trial. And in fact,
they were completely hidden.
And were hidden from you, and you were unaware that they even existed until after you were convicted of capital murder and put on death row, and you began your appeals. How many years later before you determined that there were actually gloves in that car that had been suppressed by the government?
Well, I became the first prisoner on death row in February of 1988 to ask for DNA testing when I first learned about it. When the prosecutor got wind of the fact that I was asking for DNA testing to prove my innocence, they systematically went about destroying all the autopsy material. When I discovered new autopsy material was sent to a laboratory in Willow Grove, Pennsylvania, Dennis McAndrews, assistant district attorney, sent 2 detectives to the laboratory, and they took the slides and other evidence and put them in their personal desk in their office and kept them there for 3 years and let it rot. I never knew about yeah. Go ahead.
You'd been on death row at this point for 4 years, 5 years?
No, I went in 1982, so 6 years. I was on death row before I started asking for death row DNA.
I'm fascinated.
And it took me 15 years to get it from there.
Well, and I was reading in your book about what the judge. Your trial lasted 3 days.
I had a 3-day trial.
Capital murder trial in 3 days.
Yes, sir. And the opening comments by Robert F. Kelly from Delaware County was to the jury, after thanking them for their service, he reminded them that they all had a concerned worry that their holiday on Friday of that week would be interrupted by this trial. But he promised them on Tuesday of that week that he would make sure everything would be done, that this trial would be over so that they could all go home and celebrate the 4th of July.
This is Justice for All with George Yates. We're on 1650 AM. Thank you for listening today. We're having a great show here with Nick Yarris, whose new book is called 7 Days to Live. Nick was prosecuted for capital murder for a crime he didn't commit in Pennsylvania in 1982. He served 21 years on death row. He was the first prisoner to have DNA testing finally authorized for him in March of 1988. But it was not, that DNA evidence was, now Nick's telling us, was systematically destroyed, excluded, hidden, somehow degraded, they call it. And he wasn't finally exonerated until 2003. And then when they finally exonerated and pronounced him innocent, he still remained in the penitentiary for 7 more months before they finally let him loose in 2004. And it's a fascinating book here, 7 Days to Live, which is now finally coming out and is available for you to read. And I just enjoyed every second of this book. When you're in solitary confinement on death row, no one can even begin to imagine what that must be like. Can you share with us how in the world you can survive and what it's like to be locked up in a cage that small for that long?
I still to this day think it was the greatest experience of my life. I found out so many wonderful qualities about myself, and I learned so much about the world from having the, I called it, like I learned what really it comes from when you say you're a humble person. I know where that comes from because I know what it's like to have only the next moment to live for. And I guess what it made me appreciate is how gifted I am now to have survived it, because the ability that I gave myself through education, the acumen, the ability that I have to communicate has served me the ability to survive now. And that's important to me.
You were beaten brutally many, many times. You were degraded. You were threatened. You were you were abused verbally, physically. How in the world can you now say that this was the greatest experience of your life? What an incredible...
because you just only described a small part of it. You see, I was married to a woman for 10 years. I grew and I developed. I only had one mantra. I wanted to develop myself so well so that on the day that they executed me, I could prove to them the person they thought I was long gone. And I could show to myself that the person I became was someone worthy of my own respect. So I think while all of the terrible things can be listed, I've lost a piece of my eye, I've had my hand crushed, I had personal tormentors, I've had people stab me and strangle me and do all kind of horrible things. But I look at it this way. Those efforts are only meaningful to me if I make them so. And the efforts by people to be kind and the officers who were good to me and the nice people who tried to educate me and enrich me, do I slap them in the face by holding on to only the ugly?
When I was a prosecutor in the early days, I was a prosecutor from 1985 to 1989, and I remember prosecuting rape cases and murder cases and cases that used the forensic, blood serology that you were convicted. And, that was, that's all we had, of course. And we would have the same blood type and then whether or not you secreted the antigen. And so you'd be like a B, B plus with B positive with a secretor or a non-secretor. And, that was all we had. It is amazing that we have so many, we would convict so many people based upon consistency in just blood samples like that, which are, so many people have those same characteristics, or even hair and fiber evidence, which is just not nearly as accurate as the FBI or some of these examiners will have you believe. And I'm just wondering how many people are still there on death row that have been convicted based upon this kind of suspect evidence.
Well, it's shocking when I see DNA exoneration today. I thought we were done with it. It's insane. We had a science that should have been a tool done to every major conviction across the spectrum where DNA is available. I thought that was and I'm sorry for saying this, but I thought that was the prosecutor's job, not the defense lawyers. I thought it was on the government to say, wow, we just came up with a brand new fingerprinting machine where we can fingerprint the whole place all over and we'll find you now, or something like that. I always thought it was the government's onus to turn around and say, we have a new tool to clean house. But they didn't. They were afraid of it. In fact, what I found out, of the 11 cases of men set free before me, only about 6 had the DNA entered into the data bank to find the actual killer, because the prosecutors who did enter it into the data bank caught the real killer and had a whole new mess on their hand, prosecuting a brand new capital case for the man's case that was exonerated.
Well, isn't that the reason that so often this happens? The local authorities want to say, "Hey, we've caught the guy. We've caught the guy." Then you can have a newspaper article that says, we have a suspect in custody, and therefore we can now assure the public that this killer is not on the loose. And of course, the killer still is on the loose. It's just we've got the wrong guy, and we don't want to admit later that we convicted the wrong guy. People don't like to be proven that they're wrong. Quick question: did they ever locate the real killer of Linda Mae Craig?
No. I'm actually documented as going before the county courthouse every week in a movie called After Innocence, where I used to protest outside their courthouse and make them put the DNA into the data bank. I wasn't going to leave this an unanswered question, so I did my best, and I finally got the DNA results entered into the DNA data bank, but thus far, no result matches have come through. And the shame of it is there was DNA under the victim's fingernails where she fought with her attacker, DNA inside of her underwear where it was left in spermatozoa, and DNA left in those gloves that were originally hidden before my trial as well. And yet, the shocker of it all is, despite DNA, the United States Supreme Court just took away everybody in America's Miranda rights to remain silent based on Salina versus Texas quoting my case. This is a hidden thing that people don't know about. If a police officer walks up to you, George Yates, and begins talking to you, and then you initiate silence, you are admitting guilt in a form of your demeanor.
Right, exactly.
And that I can't understand how they've changed the law and gutted the Miranda law, and now we've lost all of our Miranda rights because of Nick Yarris being convicted wrongly. This doesn't make sense to me, and it scares me that this right-wing court has done this in a manner that is shocking, because Salinas versus Texas is a man was arrested and he was questioned by police, and then he got quiet when he was asked about a murder weapon. The Supreme Court said that in my case, during interrogations, I remained quiet when I was asked did I kill the woman or why I did, and my silence indicated that I couldn't answer my own reason for killing the woman. So they effectively have stripped every American citizen of their Miranda rights.
We are here with Nick Yarris, the author of 7 Days to Live, framed for murder for 21 years on death row for a crime he did not commit, finally exonerated by DNA evidence, and has now written a fascinating book. We're here on 1650 AM. This is George Yates with Justice for All. We're going to take a short break. We're going to come back and talk to Mr. Yarris about the 15 years that he waited to get exonerated after DNA testing was ordered and before he was finally released.
Old Town Tavern in the heart of Phoebus is your place for a great lunch and dinner, specializing in fresh seafood, burgers, sandwiches, salads, appetizers, and much more. Open daily, Old Town Tavern has live music, pool tables, darts, HD TVs, and a most pleasing atmosphere. Find them on Facebook. Visit 31 East Mellon Street in Hampton with plenty of parking in the back. Call 251-2636, 251-2636, bringing great food and great people together. Old Town Tavern, the locals' choice.
All right, we're back on 1650 AM. I'm George Yates. I'm your host. This is Justice for All, and we'll start our next segment here with Nick Yarris. He's the author of 7 Days to Live, framed for murder, 21 years on death row for a crime he did not commit. And Nick is now in California, is that right?
Yes, I moved this January with my wife, Jessica, to Claremont, California, in Los Angeles, and we are now in the development of a movie script for my first book.
So
I'm hopeful.
So after you're convicted in Pennsylvania, what's the name of the prison that you were sent to?
Huntington.
And that is a notoriously dangerous place.
Yeah, one of the only prisons in that time era that was ever condemned by the United Nations for its active practices of torture. One of the things that they had done is they carried over the Quaker system of silence in your cell as a form of torture. People in the United States don't forget that prison was the alternative to the death penalty. Every crime in the United States used to be punishable by death, theft, sodomy, everything. So we came up and allowed the Quakers to come up with a prison system. And this prison system had 3 tenets. You would enter in silence, you would bow your head upon entry into that cell, and you would sit in piety and reflect upon your crime. Well, that was taken forward to the point where they used to use silence as a degradation and torture, and I didn't speak to any other prisoners really for the first 2 years.
And they actually told you that you weren't able to talk?
Well, they reinforced it on my day that I got there. They took all the other prisoners off the bus. They stood me up against a wall, and they explained to me that I was dead. And when I responded to the officer with a simple yes, sir, he smashed me in the face, turned around, and fed me to his officers for the next 30 seconds, where they beat the hell out of me. They threw me in the cell, and then the nurse came up and instructed me on how I should fill out a form to get onto the sick call list if I needed a doctor in the future.
Now, when you are on death row, you are in solitary confinement?
Yeah, 23 hours a day, all day. You get 5 days of that week. You get exercise, so it's a little bit more than that. But I did all 8,057 days in solitary confinement. In fact, they even let me go from that because, like you said, it took them 15 years to let me have the DNA testing, and it was an extraordinary, terrible journey that I went through. But then on top of it, you said, and it's true, It took them 7 months from that point to let me go, and that was a terrible ordeal upon it, because they even botched my release on the last day, as you know, and they did everything wrong. They could have at any time showed me kindness, but instead all I kept getting along the way was, you're too dangerous for us to trust.
Tell us
You're somebody... Go ahead.
Why did DNA testing take so long? I mean, if it was ordered in 1988, why did it take until 2003? Give us a sense of how that happened.
Initially, I filed the request in the Delaware County Court, and I was told that the Delaware County coroner of the time, Dimitri Konstalavos, was on board with it. Within the span of a weekend, I got a call by my attorney saying, oops, all the autopsy murder evidence from a rape and murder has been thrown away and they can't find any evidence. I then went through the trial transcripts on my own, found out that they were sent to a laboratory in Willow Grove, Pennsylvania, some evidence that did the serology testing that we talked about. So those materials that were sent to that lab to determine the B-type blood status of the killer was still viable slide preparations that were under fixed slides. When I told my lawyer of the time about this, he informed the prosecutor, who then sent detectives to abscond with that evidence and never send it over to the coroner's office for safekeeping. Just put it in their desk and let it rot for 2 years. So by the time I finally got those slides released to us in our custody, there was nothing on them. And they did the same with all of the victims' clothes. They were missing and found only because the clerk accidentally tried to hand my mother a box full of what he thought was my clothes in a box marked Yarris, and it was the victim's murder clothes.
Oh, my God. So you're saying that after you got your DNA testing approved, the prosecution continued. Not only did they frame you with a fraudulent jailhouse confession, which they knew about, they then, after you tried to get yourself exonerated, they continued to hide. They
tried to murder me.
They hid gloves. They hid gloves.
That's all what it is, George. They tried to murder me.
Well, and
look, they were so determined to keep this thing quiet.
How were you ultimately able to get exonerated then, if they hid all the evidence? What finally cleared you?
I asked to be executed. Sadly, I asked to die.
Oh my God.
And it was because the federal court stepped in and ordered the DNA testing. It was only because of Peter Goldberger in Ardmore, Pennsylvania, and the Federal Defender's Office out of Philadelphia that I got the federal funding finally, and the approval from a federal judge who said, look, I want every bit of evidence tested. And the first evidence that yielded DNA results was the killer's gloves in February of 2003. But the prosecutor said that since they withheld that evidence from my trial, no evidence found inside those gloves should now yield any exonerating evidence to set me free. This is the insanity of it.
And that's in your book. That's an incredible exchange between the judge and the prosecutor when he said, wait a minute, you're telling me that there's evidence in the gloves that exonerates him, proves him innocent, but he can't use it because you chose to withhold it from him before the trial.
Yeah, and they withheld it for a reason. George, I am 6'2". I weigh 200 pounds. Genetically, I'm a pretty big person. But when I was shooting drugs as a young person, my hands swelled up like mittens. And I'm sure you've seen the people in the street when they do this to themselves. Their hands don't look normal, do they? Well, the size medium gloves that they had left at the crime scene would have never fit me. The car seat had been moved forward. Mrs. Craig was 5'7" and she had 3-foot heels on. The car seat had been moved forward, and they measured it to a person of average height of 5'7" who was operating the car. They knew they weren't my gloves.
You mean the circumstances of her killing were that the killer actually drove her car?
He drove her in her car after all right, these are the circumstances of Mrs. Craig's death. At 4:05 p.m. on December 15th, 1981, she left work. Her watch was broken at 4:05. That's how we know when the attack happened. She was assaulted in the parking lot of the Tri-State Mall in Wilmington, Delaware. Her shoes were found in the parking lot the next day because they were pushed aside by a snowplow. It was snowing at the time of the attack. She was driven 2 miles into Pennsylvania, where she was then sexually assaulted and then stabbed 6 times in the chest and dumped into the church parking lot of a church that was only 2 miles from her home. The car was then found 2 miles away in Trainer, Pennsylvania, along the roadside with the doors locked, the lights on in the interior on, and the engine running with the gloves worn by the killer left on the front seat. The car front seat had been moved forward for a person of a short stature to operate the vehicle because she couldn't have operated it in that manner based on the mirror positioning and the seat positioning.
Now, you know a lot about your case. You must have examined your transcripts over and over and over and over again.
I know, and that's how I found the evidence, because I kept remembering Dr. Dimitri Konstalavos from Willow Grove, Pennsylvania, receiving slides and how he testified that the killer had B positive. So I said, well, where's all that evidence? So sure enough, when I found it, I thought, yeah, I got a good chance. But then duplicity, treachery, you got to understand something. I was appealing my case in the William R. Toll Annex of the Media, Pennsylvania courthouse. William R. Toll Jr. was on the bench as my trial during the process of DNA application, and William R. Toll III was on the prosecutor's team defending my efforts to not let me have DNA.
It's fascinating that there could be such a concerted effort to try to make sure that justice is not served. It's just scary. It's just absolutely terrifying to me that something like this could happen. So you spend all this time. Why didn't for a lot of our listeners, they probably don't understand. They think that, well, wait a minute, when DNA is ordered, wouldn't you assume that all evidence would be tested? I mean, why did it take till 2003 before a federal judge says we're going to test all the evidence? Why in the world wasn't that ordered in 1988? Wouldn't that make sense? Right,
but then there's all these incidents that happen. I go through this period where my mother's handed a box of evidence marked Yarris, like I said, and it was the victim's clothes, and that was in 1990.
Tell us
and the evidence. And in 1990, that evidence was extracted from that box and sent to a laboratory in Maryland, where it then sat again, while I then got the federal court help from Peter Goldberger, being my appellate attorney, and the federal court ordered DNA testing. Unfortunately, the laboratory boxed the evidence up and shipped it to California to Dr. Blake, who did the O.J. Simpson DNA, and the box broke open in shipping, and all the evidence was supposedly contaminated, so much so that the lab said that they weren't going to try and extract DNA because there would be a challenge by the prosecutor. So I sat in frustration as I had no more hope. And I got sick with hepatitis C, and my little brother died, and I stopped wanting to suffer. So I did the only thing that makes sense in 2002. After they blinded me in prison with the treatments for my illness, I asked to be executed. I thought, at least I can go out with dignity, you know?
Well, why the DNA evidence? What about the under the fingernails of the victim? Why wasn't that tested in 1988?
Because it was in the box that was... No, they were never found in 88. They were found later in the box of evidence in a clerk. Those fingernail clippings were actually found in a clerk's desk drawer in a file that was left behind other files. It wasn't until the federal court stepped in did they start to act. It wasn't until James Giles, out of the federal court, who's now retired, ordered that a fair accounting of the DNA finally take place in 2000. So you have to understand, you know this, habeas corpus. I couldn't get into the federal court until they were done abusing me in the state court. And as long as I had a DNA application in the state court, they could abuse it as long as they kept it there. And they kept it there for 15 years almost.
So you're saying when the federal judge ordered it, then the state court was ordered by a federal court, the DNA evidence together.
And I had federal funding. More importantly, I finally had federal defenders' money to pay for the DNA. Because at one point, Judge William R. Toll told me in 1989 that my DNA application was going to cost the county taxpayers $1,500, and that was a lot of money to waste on this.
Now, tell us a little bit. I know we'll get back to some of this DNA in a minute, but one of the more fascinating aspects about your history in prison was that you actually escaped from custody and were on the loose and actually ended up in Florida and did time in a Florida prison next to the infamous Ted Bundy. Tell us a little bit about your escape and how you ended up in Florida, and you write about it in your book. It's a fascinating account.
Yeah, in 1985, I was being transported to court for the abuse of evidence from all the evidence that was withheld from my trial. And even though my first appellate attorney didn't believe in me, he did file the state mandatory appeal for my case. And when he did, the state Supreme Court sent my case back for an evidentiary hearing for destruction of evidence. And I was looking forward to it. I was going to show all the evidence that was missing from the homicide file and all this stuff. And I was very eager to go. And I got picked up by two elderly sheriffs and driven to the court 5.5 hours away. And when we stopped to use the restroom in Fraser, Pennsylvania, I came out of the toilet, and the other officer who was holding the door for me went in, leaving me with one officer who was back at the car smoking a cigarette. And when he turned around, I was trotting towards him because it was bitterly cold. February 15th of that year was the coldest day of the year, and I was terrified when he pulled out his gun and started shooting at me, so I turned and ran, and then that was it. For the next 5.5 hours, I was chased by over 200 law enforcement and helicopters and dogs, and I did everything imaginable to my body trying to get away from it. I was terrified. So I ended up getting to New York City, and I stole a man's wallet, and then I went to Florida, and then after 25 days, I realized this was just mad. I couldn't do this. So I turned myself back in and went back and faced hell. And yes, I did end up 8 months next to Ted Bundy, who took a personal dislike to me because I didn't fall prey to his charming ways.
So after 25 days, you were escaped, and you weren't caught. I mean, you could have remained free.
No, this is crazy. This is the hardest thing in my life. I was sitting in Fort Lauderdale at one point, and I was going to buy a rubber raft and a big cooler and fill it full of food and alcohol, and I was going to go way out into the shipping lane, and then I was going to eat one last meal and drink a whole lot of alcohol and get myself ready, and then I was going to stab the inflatable with a knife and then kill myself and let the sharks eat me so that my family wouldn't suffer to ever see me again.
But you had escaped, and you were in Florida, and you turned yourself in. What thought process went through your mind? Why did you turn yourself back in when you were free?
Because I kept remembering what they were doing. See, I was in New York City, and I was in front of Macy's, and they had all these TVs, and I saw all the microphones in front of my mother's face. So I knew if they didn't have me, they had them. They were going to torture my family endlessly, weren't they? And so I had one choice, either end it or go back. So I went back. And they put another 30 years on top of my sentences, and they beat the hell out of me and put me through hell. But I would have rather done it because I couldn't have done that to my folks. I'm sorry. Not after I know that they did to my brother and everything while I was running.
Something I'm a little confused about, when you were ultimately exonerated of the murder of Linda Mae Craig, and you weren't just cleared on a reasonable doubt. You were given when you were given a new trial and you were cleared, and absolutely cleared and declared innocent of that charge, correct?
Yes, sir.
When you but you say 30 more years got tacked on as a result of this escape. How did you handle getting that? Did somebody decide to commute that?
Yeah, on my last day, some wonderful lawyers from Florida filed the correct petitions because I was only sentenced as I was in the state of Florida because I was a convicted murderer on escape. So I was sentenced to 35 years in Florida jail, but those charges were taken off of me once this law firm went to work for me. So I am still a convicted felon, and if I am ever arrested in the state of California for a simple misdemeanor, I know that I face the rest of my life in prison. So that is the thing that I tried not to live a fear of, and that's one of the things I moved to the United Kingdom for. So I wouldn't be in fear of losing my life, but I am a 3-time convicted felon regardless of DNA.
Which never would have happened, of course, if you hadn't been wrongly convicted in the first place.
It all stems from one thing, but in the eyes of the law, that's not really cogent, is it?
Now, you were released, and you went and you sued the state of Pennsylvania, the county in which you were prosecuted. Tell us about that lawsuit.
it was a very traumatic experience for me to go through a mini trial before we went through settlement, but it revealed the truth about the matter. You see, all along, Detective Randy Martin claimed that I had confessed to him at one point during the interrogations, and that he could prove it based on his dictated notes into a small dictaphone that he had transcribed. Well, the transcript that he handed in was actually transcribed by a woman from the Media Pennsylvania prosecutor's office who had transcribed a tape that she actually listened to and heard my voice because she described things such as sobs or laughter, nervous laughter and such. And when we went to the civil trial, I was asked to put forth a rebuttal to this alleged confession of mine, and it was this time that I proved to everyone that Randy Martin had framed me. And it was the day after that we concluded that it mattered when I got an email from one of the boys who found Mrs. Craig wishing me well. And it was so synchronized that I couldn't have thought that God had touched me at that moment, because I just went through 3 days of testimony only to find out that even the little boy who found the woman and the day after her death had forgiven me and wished me all kind of good luck.
Run that by me again. How were you able to prove that he'd framed you by the voices
A trained stenographer listens to a tape and then they type what they hear.
Right.
So in the subtext under each sentence, they would put what they hear of the accompanying sounds, it's called. So if I was to say a sarcastic sentence, it would be typed up as my words with the sarcasm in descriptive form, say, a nasty laugh accompanying.
Right.
Well, this proved that the woman wasn't listening to only Randy Martin's memory of a conversation that he had. He had secretly recorded my conversations with him during the interrogation in violation of Pennsylvania law, and thus making himself guilty of a felony. So he lied. And the things that he made up were redacted parts from a conversation anyway that didn't line up. And we could prove that the sentences claimed to have been made by me were not in actual sequence to the questions put before me.
Oh, I see. Right. He was taking statements
A and putting it with B
out of context and putting them with in connection with some other questions, so it made it look like it was.
So, all right. So it would be, why did you kill Mrs. Craig, Nick? I know you're upset by your girlfriend. Why did you kill her? And then my response was claimed to have been silence, and then I wanted to tear the whole world apart when she broke up with me. None of my preceding words made it onto the tape, explaining my answer previous to those words. So he only had her type up words that made it seem like I was guilty of answering his question.
So we've seen this. What sort of provisions did you were paid? You were given some money as a result of that lawsuit.
Actually, I had to file a lawsuit against the insurers of Delaware County because there's no compensation law in Pennsylvania for getting it wrong.
Are there compensation laws in other states?
There are. Texas pays $80,000 a year if they get it wrong, and they give lifetime medical to the people they've tortured.
Okay.
And they execute hundreds of people. So, no, there are states that do it, but Pennsylvania shamefully won't. In fact, I found this out when I was released, that I had nothing coming to me. No health care. I'm not on a parole system, so I can't get job training. I was sick. I couldn't even because I had nothing.
So $80,000 a year in Texas. If you're wrongfully convicted of a crime, does it have to be capital murder?
Doesn't have to be capital murder.
It can be anything. If you're convicted
wrongfully convicted, Texas has a compensation law.
80,000. Okay, and I know that that's a good question. I'm not sure what the law is in Virginia. I think we need to check on that. I do know that it's kind of on a case-by-case basis. I don't think that there's an actual statutory scheme that puts it in place like that. Have you had a chance to research this for other states?
No, I haven't. The only thing that I've ever noticed about Virginia was William Wilder's last day of office, where he left an innocent man in prison and made him take a life sentence based on not even telling his lawyer the results of DNA testing. And I was really disheartened by someone I used to respect as a politician.
Doug Wilder, yeah, you're right.
Yeah, that's a shame what he did, man, because there's a guy who was innocent from Virginia. DNA results came back and proved us innocent. But his prosecutor wouldn't tell the results of the DNA results to the defense attorney. he made him take a deal without knowing the results, even though the results proved him innocent.
We're here with Nick Yarris, the author of 7 Days to Live. He was framed for a murder he didn't commit, and he spent 21 years on death row in Pennsylvania, and has now written this very fascinating book, which is on the news, available September 1st, 2014. And we've just got a couple of minutes before the break, Nick. You got married while you were in prison. That's a pretty fascinating thing. What is it about men on death row that become attractive to women? You married, you met a nice woman who came to see you. How we hear about this? What's the
I
story?
was trying to be the antithesis of someone who wouldn't do that. Like I know it's strange, but when I met Jackie Schaefer from Pittsburgh, I had 105 years on me plus a death penalty, and there was no such thing as DNA, so I was done. And I didn't want this person falling in love with me, and I was on the verge of telling this person that I didn't want her coming back to see me when I found out about DNA in February of 1988, only 5 months after meeting her. So it's a strange phenomenon that bond that we developed over was based on my hope that the DNA would speak for me. And that was a different thing than what I witnessed that you're describing. And it's a terrible thing that I witnessed. Even Charles Manson is doing it to this day, where he's got a woman who he is manipulating by making her change her identity and then getting her isolated from everything she knew and getting her head around what he wants her to be is nothing more than his latest spokesperson. So it's a strange thing to be around that and be aware of the fact that this woman loves you and everybody thinks you're doing the same thing.
But you thought you were going to have a life with this Jackie, so
I know. I tried.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna. You're about to say, "Listen, you shouldn't waste your time on me." But then, hey, DNA is going to exonerate me. We'll get out any month now. I'm going to be out now. We can have a life together. And you went through this 10-year marriage with her, where you kept getting your hopes up to get out, and then to have those hopes dashed. It just had to just be torture for both you and Jackie.
It was gutting, because the evidence spilled on its way to California to Dr. Blake, like I said, and that was the break for Jackie. She just couldn't take no more. She figured I was always going to be cheated out of it, and she saw the determination by them to try and kill me. So,
and she left
said,
in '98.
And it was one of those things where it became a transition for me to find out if I truly had it in me to survive on my own, not with someone there holding my hand. Like when I met my spiritual advisor, I was cursing God in every way there was, man. I didn't believe in anything. I was so angry, and at different points you get angry, and then you realize it's just eating at you. And then I met Walter Ogrod, an innocent man who's still on death row, and it broke my heart. And it changed me.
Yeah, and
I'm glad that Ernie's now a free man. I'm glad to say anybody reading my book, 7 Days to Live, or going to my website, nickjyaris.com, you'll see that Ernie Simmons is a free man, and I'm happy for that. And Walter now has a book written about him by Tom Lowenstein, so I'm going to do what I can to come back and help my friend. I've done that, but it's terrifying that I almost killed myself over survivor's guilt when I got out.
I'd like to talk about Walter and Ernie when we get back from the break. This is Justice for All, 1650 AM. This is George Yates. I'm your host, and we're talking with Nick Yarris. And when we come back, I'd like to talk about Nick and his time on death row and how he befriended other inmates whom he believed to be guilty, even though he was innocent. And it turned out that they were ultimately exonerated as well and got off of death row. And those are some good stories to hear. So we'll be right back after this break with Justice for All.
Old Town Tavern in the heart of Phoebus is your place for a great lunch and dinner, specializing in fresh seafood, burgers, sandwiches, salads, appetizers, and much more. Open daily, Old Town Tavern has live music, pool tables, darts, HD TVs, and a most pleasing atmosphere. Find them on Facebook. Visit 31 East Mellon Street in Hampton with plenty of parking in the back. Call 251-2636, 251-2636, bringing great food and great people together. Old Town Tavern, the locals' choice.
Okay, we're back with Justice for All. I'm George Yates, 1650 AM. Thank you for listening. We are in our second hour of our interview with Nick Yarris, the author of 7 Days to Live, framed for murder, 21 years on death row for a crime he didn't commit. And while you were in prison, Nick, you befriended some other people, and one of them is an interesting character named Walter Ogrod. Ogrod. And he was a creepy, very creepy child killer, you believed. And at first, when you first met him, you didn't want to be anywhere near him, and nobody wanted to be anywhere near him. He was the worst kind of killer because he'd killed a child. Later, you, as you began meeting him in the law library and learning a little bit about his case, you learned about his case from Ernie, didn't you?
Yeah, it's strange. Another prisoner told me.
Who is Ernie?
He actually chastised me for not talking to Walter in the law library because Walter sought me out for help. But in his diminished way, he got the words wrong when he asked me. And I, like you said, I held myself a little bit away from him because if he killed that little girl, I didn't want nothing to do with him because I've been around some of them, you know.
And you weren't the only, so you were not the only innocent man on death row. Walter Ogrod was innocent, and so was this fellow. What's Ernie's last name?
Ernie Simmons.
And was Ernie innocent?
Ernie Simmons. He's now released. He's from Scranton, Pennsylvania. And, he's set free, and he was the other man that I was battling for. So,
tell us about Walter Ogrod. He's still in prison, and for a crime he didn't commit. Tell us about him.
Well, a little girl in Philadelphia at the age of 5 was abducted, sexually assaulted, murdered, and put into a television box by someone of a very nasty, clever mental makeup. Someone evil, truly evil. Walter Ogrod lived on the same street, had nothing to do with the crime, but when his own brother and his future sister-in-law were attacked in his home and the girl that was to marry his brother was murdered, Walter went to the police as a good citizen to talk to the police about that crime. While he was there to talk about his brother's attempted murder and his sister-in-law being murdered, a police officer noted that he lived on the same street and that this was a sort of a weirdo. So he asked Walter, "Did you have anything to do with Anne Marie Fahey's murder on the little girl found in the TV box?" And Walter said, "Yeah, I know about it." So the officer stopped the interview, went out and got another officer, and they got a confession out of this man who had an IQ that showed that he wasn't the clever person who did this very diabolical crime. Walter was acquitted by a jury, but the jury had a member who secretly held back until the voir dire, and during the polling of each individual juror, he shouted out that Walter was actually guilty. They declared a mistrial, put Walter back in custody, and then they got a guy named John Hall, the Monsignor of confession taking, they called him, to say that Walter had confessed to him, put Walter back on trial, and got a conviction. Now, Walter sits on death row, lingering for a crime he didn't do, and it broke my heart that I was actually cold towards him and nasty at first, because who the F was I to act like that when this man has had it worse than I have? So I started writing lawyers for him, and this is the truth. A man came to me from the media named Tom Lowenstein, and he tried to rescue me and save my life. But I said, do me a favor, why don't you help Walter Ogrod? And so he's just written a book about Walter, because and this is back when I was on death row. I didn't have no resources, nothing. I told him, please, go and help Walter, because I got things to do. I'm going to get myself executed. Won't you help him?
What forensic evidence linked Walter to the crime, or did they do it with
none? The evidence, DNA-wise, has been washed clean by a very clever criminal. Walter Ogrod doesn't have the mental capacity to go his whole life with recordings of his mental status on record, to then having one day where he outwits the entire law enforcement community and then goes back to his diminished normal self. That doesn't happen.
So, how does Walter get himself free? Can he? Is there a possibility?
I don't know, but I keep telling Philadelphia that I haven't forgotten my friend is still sitting there. But I have to walk a tightrope on this because I almost killed myself in depression over this because of survivor's guilt. Why am I free when my friend is innocent just like I was, but he's still there? And It was really hard for me even dealing with Ernie being released, strangely enough, because I couldn't protect him. and couldn't tell them how hard it is out here.
How
The
many,
first 10 years of my freedom have been a rocket ride through every human emotion you can imagine.
how many people are there on death row in the United States today?
Roughly 3,500.
3,500 people. Got any idea? Now, tell us what is this called? What is the Innocence Project for those folks out there who don't know what that is?
The Cardozo School of Law in the 1980s began proving innocent people. We're getting them their freedom through DNA efforts. It's run by Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, and a portion of every book that I sell, I'm actually going to give a donation to them because they've gotten so many people out of the situations that I lived in. And it's a shocker that 111 people were set free alone last year from exonerations and another 60-some this year alone. So the numbers are still staggering. They're not all death row cases like mine, but the numbers of years of people being taken away from them is just extraordinary.
Now, they use DNA mostly to exonerate?
DNA, faulty witness, physical evidence being suppressed, other perpetrators being caught for the crime. A lot of it has been done on a student level by the Northwestern School of Law, the California Innocence Project, and many others. And a lot of it is investigation, again, by a non-police officer. And it's one of the things that I was happy with in England is that they have what is called a community review board, where ordinary citizens are picked each month to go and review cases to see if they can come up with logical reasons why this should not be investigated and such.
Well, what do you do with a false confession case like Walter Ogrod, for instance? If it's just a false confession, and let's just legally, you've got a case, you've gone through the appeals process, which is fairly perfunctory. Most of the time, the Court of Appeals will just uphold the confession because it came in. It goes to the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. In his case, it's affirmed. How legally does Innocence Project come in and challenge this once the?
Well, a lot of it is their investigative efforts and the DNA work so many times. Like you saw, there's been over 400 people set free by DNA alone in the last 10 years.
But aren't there procedural things out there that say, you've already exhausted all your appeals, even though you might have new evidence, it's too late.
Yeah, we've seen that already, and we've heard from the court. Evidence
we
of
see in Virginia
innocence
all the
is
time.
not. Yeah, innocence is not an actual claim.
No.
I mean, you can claim that your client has facts that support a different verdict, but claiming that your client is innocent is a waste of time because it's not really relevant to the appellate process.
Right. It's just, and yet, wouldn't you think that would be the most important thing? Tell us about the lawyers that represented you that didn't believe that you were innocent. I know you wrote in your book about some that you weren't too kind to them. Tell us about
No,
the
and I'm
lawyers.
glad I made up for it. So all the listeners who will read the book eventually, I hope, will know that my first trial appellate attorney thought that I was guilty, and he wanted me to know this even before he met me. And when I did meet him, he had already filed my appeal. So I used that as an incident to actually stand up for myself to people who were treating me with professional deference. And that's what he was, an example of it. See, I wrote the book with the idea that I would be seated with an audience facing a blank wall with them. Then I would introduce each person along the way and show how they and them changed who I was and who I became before knowing them and after. I made a real effort to be fair in all ways to a lot of people, and I know that I made folly of the attorney, but the truth is, even after I got out, I did the right thing because he approached me and said, Nick, we had a bad history, but I have a client who's guilty, and he's going to put a family, his own family, to a very nasty capital murder trial, when all I need you to do is go and talk to him and get him to plead guilty, and then he'll go ahead and spare that family this misery. Would you do that for me? And I looked at him, and I said, sure. Give me the number to call, or just tell me where I got to go so I could help that family. And we shook hands.
You write this book as if you are a trained writer. You go into prison when you're 20 years old. You spend you're 20 and 82?
Yes, yeah, and nearly completely illiterate, too.
Yeah,
couldn't write a paragraph to save my life.
Where did you learn to string sentences and paragraphs? Because Listen, this is Justice for All with George Yates, 1650 AM radio. We're here with Nick Yarris, and he wrote this incredible book, 7 Days to Live. It's a fast, easy, exciting read about the justice system in America, and it's revelatory, really, about how you survived on death row and come out of it with this wonderful love for humanity. You hear about people that what's the old adage, Nick, that you seem to fly in the face of that 20 years in prison, you're institutionalized, right? We hear this, that anybody that spends more than 20 years in prison will never be able to survive on the outside. Is there any truth to that?
Well, it's an expectation of everyone based on their own ability to handle what they worst imagine. So it's like saying to the same question, "Oh God, I couldn't handle that." Well, I did. And I've not only done so, but I've developed from it. In fact, that's one of my saving graces. I learned from my simple beginnings where an officer took pity on me because I used to beat my head on the wall in frustration. And when I was coming back from the nurse's station to get my head patched up, he let me stop in his cell and pick out some books. Now, I never knew that some of them were classics and all that, but I knew one of them was a 1970 dictionary with the cover missing only, and I had a GED book, exercise booklet, and that became, along with the 1936 Tabler's Medical Encyclopedic, the foundation of my education. And I worked because I recognized something. If I didn't fill out a request slip correctly and ask for 2 clean sheets or misspelled anything on that request, they would send it back and torment me. And everything that I got wrong in writing, they would torment me for. And every time I tried to speak and I didn't have the eloquence to speak, they laughed at me and they mocked me. I worked and I worked and I worked. And I still remember today when I celebrated reading my first 10,000 books, how accomplished I felt and how at peace I felt because I thought I knew so much,
You read 10,000 books while you were in prison?
More than that, but yeah, that alone was, I got hooked. I was a drug addict, so give a junkie a new addiction, he'll go crazy on it. And I did. I went mad on education and reading. And I used to read 3 different books in a day where I would pick up a comedy in the morning and have a drama in the afternoon and have a mystery at night. I loved what people taught me from their writing, more importantly, in that I became very adept at looking at authors like Dumas or Hugo and the sufferings that they went through, or how Khalil Gibran lost his whole family writing The Prophet, but yet produced this beautiful work of art. And I thought, if I could adapt myself to this type of thought, I could write the same style and passion and bring the story to life and make humor part of it and make it everything.
You describe a rape of you as a young boy. It's a very traumatic, horrifying act against you when you were young, which you said made you develop something called aphasia.
Yeah.
And yet now you don't suffer from that, obviously, anymore. You're able to
not
communicate.
as I once did.
But
you can still tell. I flub words. I get things wrong. I become excited.
Mm-hmm.
Emotions are hard to refrain from because.
Why didn't you come forward and tell your parents about this rape so that you could have?
When he said he'd kill my family and my dog.
How old were you?
You have to understand the person that I was dealing with wasn't somebody you didn't doubt. I seen him beat grown men up, and I was only 7. So what chance could I stand against someone so physical and big? And it terrified me that he would catch me in the alley or something and reinforce his threats with new threats and always looking at me and wondering if I told. And after a while, I didn't think anyone would believe me. So that came to the Mendoza point where you're living with it because you're now joined to your attacker in a secrecy that only you know is going to be believed only by no one.
So you never told anyone about it until you wrote this book?
Until I was 24 years old, and I was on death row, and I came back from death row, and I sat down with my parents, and I said, look, I'm pretty much going to be executed. But Poppy, that was my dad, I called him. I said, I got to tell you that what happened to me as a boy and why I acted the way I did in the life that I lived is not your fault. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, someone did something to me long ago that made you unable to stop me from being who I was.
And he broke down, and I explained to him, and he wanted to go kill the guy and all that, and I said, no, just let it go, man. And it's not worth it. It's not even meaningful anymore. I got a chance to change my life now because I'm no longer held to the secret.
And so he was still alive, this fellow, when you told your dad at 24 you still could have done something about it or prosecuted him even.
Yeah, well,
yeah, too late.
Let him rot.
Right. So your parents survived your entire incarceration and actually met you and took you home from prison.
Yeah, and then I found out how overwhelming their suffering had truly been. See, my mother...
And your sister
still. There's even a video on YouTube about her conducting her own investigation. She was my alibi witness at dinner with me. How do you tell a mother, you're a liar, your son's a murderer, and you're protecting him, and then spit in her face? That's what people did to my mother.
Yeah, you had alibis.
She fought
You
for
were
me and
home.
fought for me, man.
You were home with your family the night that Linda Mae Craig was murdered. You had an alibi, a good alibi, but your parents were, your mother, who else was your other alibi witness?
My father and my sister Mabel. Yeah, we were all accused of conspiring to lie, and my father would be fired from jobs. My mom was cornered in the supermarket by some women who spit on her and called her the mother of a murderer. People used to ring my parents' house all night and wake them up and tell them that you raised the murderer, you scum, you should die like them, or make the sound of the electric chair on the phone.
A prison cell for a capital murder death row inmate is 7 feet by 11 feet.
Roughly, yeah.
And is there a toilet in there?
5 steps forward, 3 back. You have to make a turn.
Is there a toilet?
Yeah, there's a toilet, a metal bunk, and a metal desk.
Is there a TV?
Nah, that was a luxury you could earn through privileges, or they gave you one later on, but I saw it as poison. I put it under the bed. I only took it out for sports and stuff like that.
So you didn't watch much TV?
I tried not to. I only watched PBS programs on education and stuff. I tried to stay away from the mind-numbing because I saw what it does to guys. Some prisoners wouldn't even go to the hospital for treatment because they would miss their soap operas and shit. It's crazy what they go through.
Yeah, you described prisoners that will watch television 24 hours a day if they could.
Yeah, because it's a reality replacement for what they did. See, some of them delighted in tormenting us. Some of them performed acts portraying the death of some of their victims and such.
Yeah,
a lot of men.
There are many, of course, many of the. We've talked a little bit about the people on death row that are innocent. Of course, the vast majority of them are probably guilty for what they've done because they've even confessed to it, and the confessions are real. And you describe in your book, people that apparently revel in the fact that they're guilty of the crimes that they commit. Tell us about these sickos.
Well, the thing is, you find that, and this is a lesson that I'm glad I learned, the most horrible predator of women and children, those serial killers, to a man, they're all cowards. Face another man, face someone who would be a serious threat, never. And that's the thing, they're predators, and the way that they talk about humanity shows in the way that they act and stuff. And I've had dealings with a couple of them tried to stalk me, to murder me and stuff. I had no time for them. I wasn't a convict, so I didn't live a creed of a convict. I wasn't a guard. I was none of these things. I was a visitor in this alien world, and I was going to keep myself as an alien until I got out of there because I didn't want to fall prey to the mindset of having this Bushido-like code where I would attack and kill people because they wronged me and stuff. Like, I learned a valuable lesson. Anger is a free man's luxury.
Well, I'm fascinated by how you're able to do 21 years for a crime you didn't commit and not be angry.
Well, if you look at it, I had to pay for what I was. Let's make this clear. I was a scumbag. I was a thief. I was a liar. I cheated people. I wronged people. I disgraced myself. So I had to pay, and I made myself pay and pay and pay until I felt it was fair. And then I paid some more so that I could hold my head up for what I was. And how I started this by making up a stupid story about that woman's crime. And I made myself suffer for that. not for what they made me suffer for.
The effort that you made on your own behalf to get yourself exonerated, and you describe it in the book so eloquently. You woke up every day determined to prove your innocence for 15 years. Was that your single-minded? I mean, you write about it in the book that way. Is that actually how it was? You from March of 1988 until your release in 2004, was that just a single-minded effort on your part every single day?
It became a torment at times, too, because hope is a terrible thing. At times when you want so much for so many other people, hope just drags all the life out of you. So at times I was terribly tested by the desire to get the DNA testing done, and then I went through so many phases where I was cheated, and it was never going to come. And then when I was sick and dying, I didn't think it was real, so I let go. And it's strange how it was only going to come about once I let go and took control of my destiny. And I'm proud of what I did, but it took a lot of hurt, and it hurt a lot of people, and I'm sad for what had happened.
You had a marriage that lasted 10 years, and then after your marriage broke up from 98, did you have other significant relationships with women when you were from, let's say, 98 until 2004?
No, I went on this different journey. I managed to circumnavigate the globe while sitting on death row by mailing out snippets of my hair to pen pals all over the world. Instead of one person, I wrote to everybody I could, and I shared vicariously their lives. And I have pen pals that when I was finally released invited me to go and visit them in Poland and in France and the United Kingdom. And it was wonderful that they knew me at a time when my life was so sincere that they could still see I'm still that person that got out of death row and remained true to being that person. Strange. Very strange.
You ultimately sued the people that convicted you wrongfully, and you settled the case. How much money did you receive, or is that classified?
$4 million.
You received $4 million. How much of that came to you?
3, and then I gave it all away or was robbed of it all. So
It's
I
all
went
gone?
from being a millionaire in 2008 to being destitute in 2010.
Where'd all the money go?
A lot of it was stolen from my ex-partner. She took $1 million from me. A lot of it went to defend my book in court. A lot of it just was given to family, and a lot of people saw that I was a soft touch, so they came up with every imaginable ploy to rob me.
Yeah,
So I had people just, and it was a shame that I lost a lot of relationships because of the money. And in the end, it didn't matter anymore. So it was pity money. You know what I mean?
So when you got out of prison in 2004, you got married and you had a child.
Yeah, Laura.
And she's 7 years old.
Just turned 8.
Eight.
Yeah.
Where does she live?
In the United Kingdom.
And do you get to see her?
I live now in California, so no.
And do you have a visitation schedule, or do you have any kind of arrangement where you get to see her? Or
No, sadly, that didn't go well. So I decided to let her develop in happiness with the money that I gave to her mother.
All right.
And I figure at least she's a millionaire. She doesn't have to worry about anything.
So you have no communication with Laura at all?
No. I've been cheated out of that. And it was a test not to do violence to the world over something like that. But I learned again that
And you've remarried?
It's your ego, isn't it, George? You've been tested by this young man. You've seen the damage that people do because of their ego. They destroy their lives, their relationships, and who they are because of their ego. And I'm determined not to do that. If it wasn't for my recognition of what was done to me in prison, I couldn't be in love with Jessie. And that's where I'm really happy that everything turned around, because she read the book. And like you, she took time to see who I was for the writing. And then she sought me out, and we began a relationship 4 years ago, and it's turned out to be all the saving grace that I could ever hope for.
We're here with Nick Yarris. His book is 7 Days to Live. framed for murder he didn't commit, and spent 21 years on death row in Pennsylvania before he was exonerated by DNA evidence and declared innocent of the murder of Linda Mae Craig in 1982. We're going to take a short break. We'll come back for the last 25 minutes of our interview with Mr. Yarris, and we'll be right back after these messages.
Old Town Tavern in the heart of Phoebus is your place for a great lunch and dinner, specializing in fresh seafood, burgers, sandwiches, salads, appetizers, and much more. Open daily, Old Town Tavern has live music, pool tables, darts, HD TVs, and a most pleasing atmosphere. Find them on Facebook. Visit 31 East Mellon Street in Hampton with plenty of parking in the back. Call 251-2636, 251-2636, bringing great food and great people together. Old Town Tavern, the locals' choice.
Okay, this is George Yates. We're on the Justice for All show, 1650 a.m., and we'll be here for another 30 minutes with Nick Yarris, continuing in his account of his years in prison, wrongfully convicted of a crime he didn't commit. We were just saying during the break, we were talking off the air, and I was just saying to Nick Yarris here, if I were wrongfully convicted of a crime and I had escaped from prison and I was in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and I was free, I would never turn myself back in. I just wouldn't do it. I was reading your book. I said, okay, he's escaped, he's free. And what are his choices? To try to stay on the run and get loose, or go back to this torture chamber of a prison in Pennsylvania where all they want to do is kill me? I wouldn't have gone back. I wouldn't have escaped. I wouldn't have gone back. If I escaped, I wouldn't have turned myself back in again. I just wouldn't have done it. And I was reading your book. I said, God, he turned himself back in. And you did it after a conversation you had with your father. What was that? And what would make you turn yourself back in after you've escaped? In fact, when you turned yourself back in, you didn't even want to let the other prisoners know you'd done that, because you knew they would turn on
torture me.
Yeah.
And,
why did you go back to prison after you'd escaped? What in the world? Why would you ever go back?
Because I knew that my brother Mikey, who was only 11 months older than me, was having pistols thrown to his head and thrown to the ground, and every time he went into a bar to have a drink, somebody thought it was me because we looked similar, and he was carrying the burden of it. And they were raiding my family's house with SWAT, and they weren't going to stop looking for a death row prisoner escapee who they thought was going to go and kill someone else. So I had two choices: either man up and go back, and I mean, you got to understand, I knew what they were going to do to me, and they did exactly what I figured. They beat me for 4 minutes with truncheons that were 3 foot long. Those riot sticks, man. They beat me so bad they knocked a piece of my eye out. I knew that was coming, but what do? You let your family hold the bag? You let them suffer? You let them linger on being tortured? At least if you're back in prison, everything can go quiet again, and you can maybe let them have a life. That's what I was thinking.
What did your dad say to you that made you go back?
I can't do anything for you, Nick. This is too big. You got to do this. And I was like, oh, man. So there was a FBI agent in the Philadelphia office who was really a nice guy named Bud Warner. So I said, Dad, do me a favor and call Officer Warner and tell him, I'm in Volusia County and they need to come and get me because I can't promise that I'll just be here. I hung the phone up and I just sat there, and man, Jesus, all the people in the world came out of nowhere. And yeah, they made really a good folly of me, of showing me out to be this deranged person. But the truth is, it didn't matter that I handed myself back in. I had scared everybody, so I was the monster.
Tell us about Ted Bundy. You served a time on death row in Florida when Florida was one of the worst places to be. That he was ultimately executed in Florida for a series of murders. How did you have contact with Ted Bundy? Tell our listeners about him. He's probably one of the most famous.
In 1985, when I went to Florida's death row in the East Unit of Rayford, Ted had gotten in trouble by telling the press how he got one of his groupies pregnant, so everybody on death row lost their contact visit, and everybody wanted to kill him. So they had him back in the hole with me, and since I was an escapee, a high risk, they had us all in this secure area, and we all talked amongst ourselves through the ventilation system, but everybody hated on Ted for what he had been. And he used it as his opportunity just to interfere with everything we spoke of or anything. He was just a nightmare to deal with, and he was this supercilious person where everything was below him, and he saw from afar how godlike he was, and it was sick. And I had an incident where he spit on me and everything, but it just goes to show that, once again, people like that are just, they're devoid of any human redemption in a lot of ways, and the best thing to do is just let them rot there with their own hope.
Ted Bundy was on death row and ultimately was executed in Florida for 26 murders.
More than that, according to the state federal prosecutors, something like 48 possible victims. But
this was all during the mid to late 70s in Washington State, and I remember I lived in Washington State during those years. I was in college up in the Seattle area, and I remember talking with a friend of mine one time. The fellow, he was only known as Ted. They knew there was this killer about, and everyone knew that his name was Ted. And so I remember one time a friend of mine, a young guy, talking to a girl in a bar, trying to meet her or something like that. And he had said to me that this girl said to him, "I can't go with you. For all I know, you might be Ted." And so, yeah, he's really famous for that, because there was a period of time where the entire Seattle area was just terrorized by that, because there was a lot of women.
He glorified in it. He loved that. He used to talk about how
women disappeared. Women were disappearing all over in Seattle and the Green Lake area and so on. And then he left the Seattle area, and then the murders began happening around Tallahassee, and around Florida State, and I guess or Gainesville.
Well, after this is how he tried to befriend me, because he escaped from custody and he went through the extradition process. So he tried to befriend me under the notion that he was going to save me from going back to Pennsylvania. Like I needed saving from something I turned myself in for, but I didn't have time for him. And when I disrespected him, he just went. And this is the strangest thing. He was only slight, I'd say 5'9", maybe 170 pounds. He wasn't big.
He'd actually gone to law school.
This thing that came out in him freaked me out. Like it was, how can I describe it? All right, there was a person in front of me talking to me in this very solicitous manner, very professional, who, once I said to him that I didn't share the same joy of getting my jollies off by killing little girls thinking about killing my mommy, this thing happened in him where he transitioned into this beast, is all I can say, where the frothing mouth, the trembling and his face twitching, and the cord of vein in his neck and forehead, combined with this smell, an overpowering smell of chemical that came out of him. Wow, like this, you cannot ever imagine a complete flip unless you've seen an animal do it. Like you see an animal on those shows where they attack for no reason and stuff. This was the only way to make sense of it. And the smell, it was like ammonia mixed with really pungent sweat, and it was really ugly, where he was this demon. No, this one was different. Oh my God.
Wow. And here you were a condemned killer, and you weren't a killer, and here you were face to face with a real killer.
Yeah, and we were separated by this metal mesh of the screens in the law library, but he was kicking against it and screaming, and I held my legal folder up while he just went, he kept saying things. It was weird. The things he screamed were like these drawn out things, like, I will rain down upon you, and like it wasn't the thing somebody says to you that's normal, like, hey you fucker, excuse my language, hey you bastard, I'll kill you, you know what I mean? He was full on with this, like, drawing up these references of demolition and destruction and raining down upon me with, brimstone. It was weird. It was so weird to encounter someone so completely insane.
Yeah, he I guess he had a messiah complex.
And that's what it was. The things he screamed, how he was going to make me feel the woes of Saul.
Yeah.
I'll make you crawl to the Damascus gates in pain. He was screaming, and I'm thinking, you're not even Christian. What the hell are you screaming? But I guess it made it sound very terrifying in his mind.
When was he executed? What year was that?
A couple of years after I left, so I think it was 89 or somewhere around there, he was executed. And they actually executed Jesse Trevero in Florida, who was innocent, and his wife got out, and she was proven innocent, Sonny Jacobs, and I met her. And it's a shame that I actually knew Jesse, and that I told Jesse, his wife, a quaint story of when I met Jesse, how he wore a Buddhist ring, and it broke my heart to know that he was actually innocent like her, but they executed him.
How did you know he was innocent after he got executed?
Well, the other guy confessed now, hasn't he?
Oh.
See, Jesse and his wife picked up a friend and took him on a ride in Florida along the highway, and 2 o'clock in the morning, the officer was shot at a rest stop. But it showed that the bullets came from the passenger front seat, and the person in the front passenger seat wasn't Jesse Trevero, and it wasn't his wife, Sonny, who was sleeping in the back seat of the car with the babies. It was the guy they picked up. And he finally, well, he was smart. He took the deal and claimed that Jesse and Sonny did the murders for a life sentence while they went to death row, and he was smart enough to parlay that into sparing his life. After he did that, he then told the truth, but it's too late, isn't it?
Yeah. Death is different, isn't it?
Yep. It's a police officer. They're going to put somebody on death row.
Mm. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So a smart criminal says, hey, I'll take the deal. I'll plead guilty. You don't even have to have a trial.
Mm.
Yeah.
So,
and
Nick,
what someone else on death row.
You've been released since 2004, and now here it is, 2014. You've just releasing this book. You've got a film, apparently, and another book. Tell us about, first of all, this book. For those of you who've just tuned in, we're on Justice for All, 1650 AM. I'm George Yates. I'm your host. We've been here for the last hour and a half or so with the author Nick Yarris, who did 21 years on death row for this crime he didn't commit. And now you've got another film coming out and another book. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I have... I'm going to release my second book next year to follow on with this first book, 7 Days to Live. And I have a documentary that's going to come out in January. So I'm very excited that I'm getting a chance to go and promote my art in a very positive way. Since being released, I went and I strived very hard to become a very polished speaker so that I could show young people who have gone through childhood trauma that they can overcome it with education, that they can work at it, and get for themselves a platform if they wish. And it's been a great honor that I've spoken at Cambridge, Oxford, Stanford University, throughout the United Kingdom. I've spoken. It's been a great, great honor that young people get this message, that it isn't all about the glory of all the story. It's the true heart of the message, that we have to be loyal to the things that matter.
Do you tell people if they were threatened with the same kind of threats that you had to come forward? How do you feel about your decision?
That's one of the things that I'm really touchy about, because I don't ever want to come across as someone who should say things in this regard, because I did the opposite. I kept my mouth shut. I can just show as an example how it destroyed my life, because without the support of someone saying to you, you're a little boy, it's not your fault. I didn't have that, George. I didn't have someone to just tell me once, it's not your fault. This is something that adults do because they have a thing in them that makes them do it. See, because I thought it was the thing in me that made me the reason I was attacked. So if I could ever be an example to anybody that's ever gone through this,
and you were attacked by another.
It ain't your fault.
You were attacked by another boy or a young man. How old was this
young man? Yeah, he was about 20, I guess.
And you were how old?
And I was 7.
And you were anally sodomized?
Yeah, he freaked out when I came to and hit me in the head with a large field stone, and that was the last I remember. And then I woke up and I went home, and I had to go to the Wills Eye Hospital, where I was treated for a major contusion across the front of my forehead that was about 7 inches long. And I became myopic, and it's strange. I went from being a right-handed person to a left-handed person. And everything overnight changed, where I couldn't throw a ball right-handed anymore. I had to throw it left-handed. And I couldn't, go and process language anymore. Everything became garbled, and I developed a really serious case of dyslexia, so I became disruptive in class, and I didn't like wearing glasses because the kids teased me, and it just ruined every self-esteem that I could have ever had.
And you didn't tell your parents because you were threatened?
Yeah, because he told me if I did tell that they'd let him out, and before the trial he'd kill me. Now, I didn't even understand all that, but I understood that he would come back. And he made it very believable to himself, convinced me that he would come back and get me. So I did the thing that I thought I could do and protect my family from being murdered by this man who promised to kill them and my dog. And it shattered me in a lot of ways, but what do you do? How do you go back and undo that?
And then after this abuse, you spent you of course ended up with a life of drug abuse and petty theft. You ended up being framed for this murder, and you were abused by guards. Tell our listeners what these guards are like.
Not all of them, just a few. There's a few bastards in the bunch always, and it goes across the board in every profession, because it shames the many wonderful prison officers that I hold myself indebted to, who treated me with kindness and fed me and cared for me. There's always going to be people who, in their own weak life, see opportunity to exact vengeance. Like, I've had some really terrible things done to me by people who believe that they were exercising some demon in me by harming me. Now, I didn't understand how a man could do those things to me and then go home and play with his children and claim himself to be a Christian when he had beaten someone so bad that they had urinated on himself and laughed about it. Like, I didn't get that. That was, I think the problem is this, George. We empower young people straight from the military with no psychological training to be in charge of our most horrible people. And from this, we are expecting them not to develop alcoholism, spousal abuse issues, or none of these psychological things that any untrained person is going to experience.
You had a one guard that you observed throw some scalding coffee into an inmate's face, who later apparently was a guard at Abu Ghraib and was investigated there for prisoner abuse. And of course, everyone knows about Abu Ghraib and the prisoner abuse that was going on there. Tell about this particular guard. Did you ever testify against him in the military tribunal against him?
I was asked to testify against him by the United States government, oddly enough. I mean, here you are, being exonerated from death row and set free, and then the government turns around and says, oh, by the way, can you please come and testify against the man who tortured you like he just got done torturing Iraqi prisoners in 2005? And I was wowed by the fact that they had the nerve to think that that was something that I was actually going to do for them.
Yeah.
All I was going to do was use it as a platform and go there and shame them.
Yeah, because he knew that you were a witness against him while you were there in the Pennsylvania prison, and came.
Well, what had made it bad for the prosecutor is this, and this is what I was told. They did not want to show that they've trained people to torture others like this in this fashion, the way that Charles claimed he was trained. Charles claimed that he did nothing more than what he was trained to do in Pennsylvania as a prison guard specialist on his application. So they made it, they made it clear they didn't want me to go in there and affirm for everyone, this is what we train human beings to do. We train them to gladiator the prisoners against each other for our amusement. We train them not to feel anything while beating senseless out of people.
You describe an incident in the prison where you see these robotic guards dressed in helmets and armored gear dragging prisoners all night long during a riot, which you describe it's almost like an out-of-body experience for you while you were observing that.
The only way you can deal with that much grief, isn't it? You have to stop.
And once again, it's just a fascinating read how you describe these incidents, and it was years later. You didn't write this down at the time, did you?
No, I wrote the entire book in 5 weeks in 2007 in England while sitting in a house there.
And you didn't have a ghostwriter, and you didn't have somebody assisting you with it. You wrote this book. How many drafts did you go through to write this book?
No, I did the same thing with the second book. I wrote the second book in only 3 weeks by sitting down and writing it. That's it. Like I say, the greatest honor of my life to this day, to prove my education is valuable, is the letter I got from the editor assigned to me by HarperCollins, who simply said that to date, mine was the least amount of work he had to do. And I take that as a great honor because I truly was shattered as a young person going to prison, and it was only through education that I made this effort. So we can say a lot of things about all of the other events, but the one thing I'm grateful for is the fact that I stuck my nose in a book and I became eloquent.
Did you, and you got your GED while you were there in...
I never got a certificate of anything. I wasn't there to do it for that. You understand? Right. The whole reason I educated myself was for one moment. When they were executing me, I only did it for one thing. I wanted to prove to all of them on the day that I left that I could speak eloquently, that I didn't have to be teased. And see, they used to torment me, George, and go, do. When I would get angry, I couldn't speak, and I would flub everything, and I couldn't have the eloquence to say words that needed to be said, and I would be so tortured by that was my only goal. I just wanted, on the day that I died, to have the ability to have enough to speak for myself.
Did you ever have an execution date set?
I was within 60 days of the warrant being signed when I asked to be executed in 2002. So they would have probably executed me in 2003. There's only been 4 other people in Pennsylvania executed, and all of them have been volunteers.
So you volunteered to be executed. You'd finally had enough.
I had enough, sir. Enough of this drama and suffering. I had educated myself enough to feel that I had found out enough about the world and enough about myself to see that I was just a small cog in a bigger thing, and that I should let go because all I was doing was causing myself unnecessary suffering.
Well, when I read the title of your book, and I think a lot of people there might say, well, the book reads 7 Days to Live. So my first thought was, well, he was 7 days away from being executed when the final papers came through to say that he was, innocent. DNA evidence had cleared you. And so the 7 days to live, what's the reason?
It's the reference that my spiritual advisor, Kathleen Grace, came and met me when I was at my worst.
And she said what?
To me she said to me when I asked to be executed, what happened? Why did I stop living as if I only had 7 days to live? What happened to the gregarious, caring, sweet person she met who, despite losing his wife, having the evidence of the DNA lost, and having seemingly no hope, could still come out here and smile with me and talk to me in a gentle fashion? And now, what happened to that person? Why do you no longer have those 7 days to live? And I'll never forget it. It was a question I could never ask. So I guess my question to all of the world is, I hope you have an answer for why you don't live each day as if you only have 7 days to live.
So you're trying to tell us, the rest of us, that we should live 1 week at a time.
You got 7 days to live. George, you could have died today when your car broke down, when you stepped out of the vehicle and someone hit you.
That's right.
You could have died from the heat. Someone in transit coming to help you could have died today, but they didn't, blessedly.
Well, I do think...
The truth is,
I do think
you didn't think about any of that. Yeah, but
right.
That's the reality.
And you have to.
I'm gonna live my life like I know it's going to end.
And it sounds like you're living for tomorrow right now with all these projects you've got going on.
Yeah, I'm very grateful that I've hired a professional scriptwriter because I am not a person that thinks himself to be that clever to be able to do a professional movie. So I hired a professional scriptwriter to develop a script from the first book, and it's wonderful. I have a very good opportunity in Los Angeles with the support of many people in the acting community to do something with this material. And like you said, it is a good read, and I'm very grateful for that because I throw my hat out there as a great writer, not as a former prisoner, but as an author, someone who has made the effort to tell a tale regardless of where I came from.
Well, it's a fascinating read. Now, going forward, you got any more speaking engagements in the next several weeks and months? Tell us what you're about to do.
I'm about to have my national debut on CNN and other programs. I have bookings for Drake University and San Diego State University. I'm going to start speaking this fall at other major universities, and that's what I'm passionate about. I don't care about being recognized. What I want to do is go what I've been doing for several years and get someone in that audience who went through what I went through at a young age to make the change and fix their lives and get a good education.
Do you have a website that our listeners can contact you on? And what's the best way of obtaining your book? We might as well do a little more of that right now before we're about to wrap up.
NickJYarris.net, and you can find me on Facebook, and you can find me on my website. You can order books. I'll send signed autographed copies, hardback, to you if you reach out to me. You can find it on Kindle as well in electronic form, and you can order paperbacks off of CreateSpace. But I'm looking forward to actually sending out signed copies because that means a connection to me. So what I do is I buy a bunch of copies and I sit somewhere by the ocean or something, and I sign them well before I meet you so that the words I wrote to you show the respect that I had even before you open that first page.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a really interesting way of connecting with everyone because I like the way, at the very beginning of your book and at the very end of your book, it's as if you are reaching your own personal catharsis when you write this book. And it's different than any other book that I've ever read, but then I don't think I've ever read a book by anyone that's gone through the experience that you've gone through. It's a very, to say it's unique. Is there anyone else that's ever served 21 years on death row and been exonerated? In other words, yeah, are you the longest serving death row inmate?
Well, certainly in Pennsylvania. Yeah, I'm one of very few people who's ever survived 23 years in solitary confinement, 8,057 days, proven innocent by DNA, and not killed myself.
Right.
A lot of the prisoners who served more than 20 years, 80% of them in the first 5 years try to kill themselves.
Did you ever try to kill yourself?
I did. I actually had an incident early on because of survivor's guilt where I was going to drive my motorcycle into a truck just because of the pain of this thing that was just eating at me. And
this was after you were released, you mean?
Yeah, after my release.
But while you were in prison, did you ever try to commit suicide?
Yeah, early on, in my first week of being charged as a rapist murderer, when all the inmates were torturing me and stuff, and the guards were letting it go, I hung myself, but the officer cut me down and told me he was going to keep me around for the full ride, he said.
Wow, it's just an incredible story. And then what made you not run your motorcycle into a truck? What made you change your mind on that suicide?
I don't know. I guess I'm a coward. I don't know. It's a strange feeling, but I pulled over, and then there was an old man on the roadside, and he had a dog with him, and I was really bitter because I just got out of prison, and I was still sick with hepatitis, and I was told that I couldn't get on the donors list, and I live in all this, and so I didn't have a lot of faith in it, you know what I mean? And then I didn't know that in just 6 months I would be completely healed. All I did was eat my mom's soup and start to exercise and take care of myself, and all of a sudden I didn't need drugs, and I didn't need treatment, and I didn't need a new liver.
Well, so you've managed to survive this hepatitis. Do you still have the hepatitis?
I have nothing. I have zero. My wife and I just went through medical treatments when we moved from the United Kingdom to Los Angeles, and I have zero. I know. There's even an article by the Pennsylvania School of Medicine about how I'm one of the first, or the very few who's ever gone from a terminal diagnosis of hepatitis C to having none, and I mean zero. That's crazy.
And I
have 2 collapsed discs in my neck, and yet I'm not in any pain.
And
T1 and the C6 with trapped and impinged nerve roots, and if anybody has a medical understanding, they know I just described agony on this earth, and yet I walk around every day with no pain. And I don't understand any of the things that have happened to me. All I know is that I've tapped into the positivity of my life, and it's really working for me.
I know we only have a minute or two left. You never went back to drug and alcohol abuse. You've remained sober ever since.
No, I don't drink, and I don't take any over-the-counter medications either because I can't because of liver damage. All my life I'll have kidney and liver damage, and it'll be in a degraded form, but it's stable, and that's the good thing. So as long as I don't take ibuprofens and stuff like that or drink alcohol, I'm fine. And that's the good thing, is I stayed away from it because William Nieves, who got off at death row in Pennsylvania, didn't. And I watched him drink himself to death. So it was a real lesson to me not to do anything like that.
You know, a lot of prisoners get religion when they're in jail, and they talk a lot about the Bible and all of this sort of thing, and God and this and that. And I'm not meaning to disparage God or promote God, but it is interesting, actually it's just something that I've just really noticed. But as I go through your book, I don't see any scripture. I don't see that the Bible or any of this sort of religious epiphany occurred.
I don't think that's fair to anyone.
Yeah,
I think I get it, and I think that's one of the things I wanted to.
You're obviously a very deeply spiritual person. There's no way you could have survived this ordeal and still have the positive view that you've got towards the world and towards all the people that have wronged you, and this wonderful recognition of, even though you didn't commit the crime that you were convicted of, you realized that you'd committed other crimes for which you needed to be punished, and you have this remarkable acceptance of your punishment, not for the crime but for your other acts, and you don't lay it off on God or Jesus or anything else. You find some sort of, it seems to me, some secular strength or some personal humanistic strength. Where do you get your
beautiful way of
spirituality?
describing it? But I think what I've done is I've stolen all the good tenets of all the major religions that mean something decent. I've ignored all the madness while just putting perspective on who I truly am. I'm no one. George, I'm just a guy that got arrested for being an idiot, who's hopefully, despite all the mean things done to him, has shown that I can be someone decent enough to be your neighbor or to sit next to you in a restaurant and be a normal person. That's my goal. To someday have no one ever know who they are and know nothing about me and only enjoy the encounter of who I am. Isn't that our goal? Isn't that who we want to be? Unless you have a really bad ego, I don't see where I am anyone special. But yeah, God's touched my life in so many ways. I can't be ignorant of that fact.
Well, it's been a great pleasure having you on the show today, and I hope that for your sake that you do well with this book. And I'd like to thank Nick Yarris for being on the show today. This book is 7 Days to Live. He spent 21 years on death row in Pennsylvania and was exonerated by DNA evidence after fighting for 15 years to clear his name, framed for a murder that he did not commit, for a young woman who apparently the killer is still at large, of Linda Mae Craig, and unfortunately still out there, right? Or maybe caught for something else. You never know. But it's fascinating, Nick. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Now, this was a great honor. And I want to thank you for actually reading the book. And it's something a lot of hosts will never do for me in the future. And I don't ever want to take that as anything other than a huge tribute to what I've made an effort for. Well, if anybody that listens to this understands what I've gone through, or they've gone through similar things, you can always reach out to me on Facebook or on my personal website, Nick J. Yarris, and I really am grateful to you and your staff today. Thank you.
Well, good luck on CNN and your other speaking tour this year. Listen, I hope you and your wife are successful in conceiving a child. I think that's going to be important, and I think you'll be a great dad to your next child, and I'm sure lots of people would look forward to having you as their neighbor. So
thank you, sir.
We'll hopefully stay in touch, and I'll look forward to seeing you around and taking a look at your next documentary and your next book. So
thank you, sir.
Okay, great. Well, listen, this is Justice for All, 1650 AM. We've spent the last 2 hours with Nick Yarris. It's been a pleasure being with you today. We'd like you to tune in next Saturday between 2 and 4. We'll have another great guest to discuss some great topic, and I'm not sure who we have next week. I'm sure Dee will tell us in a minute. I'd like to thank my engineer, Dee Thomas, who's been helping me here with today, as well as Greg Hall, our producer. And you have a great afternoon. We'll look forward to seeing you next week. This is George Yates signing off for Justice for All.